Okay, thank you so much for joining us virtually and also in person. Really looking forward to discussing some work that we have done over the last few years. We're talking about Inuit knowledge sharing in recreation. My name is Leila Kelleher. I'm from Parsons School of Design, and we also have Qumangaapik, Arnatsiaq, joining us from Igloolik. Unfortunately, Sherri can't make it today, but Sherri Branscombe is one of the co-authors of this work, but she's unable to join us today. So yeah. The clicker is not working. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project background, then process that we followed to develop this resource, and then finish off with some of the resource training that we have done. Next slide, please. So in past years, starting in about 2015, we began traveling to Nunavut in the north of Canada to deliver some community recreation. So that included high five training, as well as some Jays Care play ball training and Rugby Canada training for the recreation staff. And then this led to like a multi-year partnership with the Recreation and Parks Association of Nunavut, or RPAN. Through that work with RPAN, we did a number of things, like we went to different communities. Next slide, please. And we created 3 community strategic plans for recreation. So that was done through a process of whole community events, because the communities are quite small, and as well as focus groups in various age groups, youth, parents, other adults, and elders. And from that, we developed some strategic planning tools to allow the recreation directors and staff to be able to apply for funding more effectively, since the federal government and also the territorial government is very much set up in a kind of forward-looking framework, and that doesn't always work with how things are done on the ground. We also deal with some youth leader, recreation leader training in Toronto, and led out 3 training conferences for RPAN in 2018, 19, and then 2022. And each one of those training conferences was usually comprised of about 80 recreation leaders. And from that work that we did at the training conferences, we really identified some holes. So, for example, some of the materials that Sport and Rec Nunavut had been sending out were really, aimed at, creating an emergency plan, or doing, these kind of fairly high-level tools and resources that they were producing, without realizing that the recreation leaders hadn't necessarily led out a multi-community sport tournament before, though some had. And the beauty of the training conferences is it brought together recreation leaders from all over the territory. And so we saw an opportunity to really create a knowledge sharing resource so that the communities could learn from one another with an Inuit-specific tool. Next slide, please. So our goal for this project was to create an Inuit-specific tool for recreation planning. There aren't any resources, appropriate resources available, and I think we identified this really early on in our work in Nunavut, when my colleague Sherri was delivering high five training, which is recreation training, and it had slides of multi-sport arenas and swimming pools and just physical resources that many of the communities just did not have. And so multiple staff members, when it could only, oftentimes it was just 1 or 2 people working part-time as recreation leaders in the communities. And so she was able to adapt that training to deliver it more appropriately in Nunavut. So we were already kind of aware of this theme of things not being appropriate for small communities, and certainly not being culturally appropriate as well. Next slide, please. So in 2019, we planned to develop a resource basically facilitating the development of a resource by the recreation leaders present at the conference. But as is the case in Nunavut, the weather came in, and so unfortunately only about half of our attendees were able to attend that event, but we still had a really good turnout. And so the resource was created by leaders from Igloolik, Pond Inlet, Iqaluit, Kimmirut, Arctic Bay, Clyde River, Whole Beach, and Resolute. We developed these two resource kits, and so I'm going to just pass it out for people in the room. Next slide, please. And so the first activity that we did was really having our leaders identify targets, so which resources they wanted and needed. And what they did is they realized that they wanted a resource for planning sport tournaments, multi-community sport tournaments, and then for events. And in this context, events meant intra-community events, so such as like Nunavut Day. And this is all knowledge that they do this work every day in their jobs, but you know, there are definitely best practices that they shared with one another. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can you go back? So what happened is, so the first step was the recreation leaders were sitting at mixed tables with one another, and they were brainstorming all the steps that it took in order to plan, you know, events or plan a sport tournament, all the things that needed to be considered, from budget to personnel to activities that would happen at each of these events, each of these things. Next slide, next point. From that point, they sorted their post-its by theme, and then eliminated any repeats there. And then they went on to finalize what would be on the cards. So we decided to create these card decks so that they could really be an open-ended resource that could be used in a variety of different ways according to who was using it, what they wanted to get out of the cards, and so we produced these two decks. So next slide, please. The recreation leaders also conceptualized the artwork that would be appropriate for each of the cards. So you can see here someone is drawing a picture of that would go on the marketing card. Next slide, please. From there, we did translation into Inuktitut, Inuktitut, English and French, and then we had our students at Humber College, which is where I was working at the time, finalize the artwork and lay out the cards to make them press ready. And what we came up with is these two decks contained in boxes like this. And so you can see that the decks are pretty hefty and they contain a lot of cards, and they wouldn't necessarily be ones that you would always use, but as I said, they could be used in a variety of different ways. Next slide, please. So then we had the pandemic. So they were produced, they were printed, and then they sat for a couple of years because we weren't having the conferences. And in 2022 is when we delivered the training for how to use them. Here are some photos from the conference. We were on the lower left-hand side, you can see we were discussing ways that recreation leaders might get some feedback from the community about what activities they wanted to do in terms of programming, and then we were just doing some activities there on the upper right-hand side. And that was followed by the training for the cards. So we took the recreation leaders through different methods of using the cards, and Qumangaapik is going to join us and let us know some of those methods for using the cards. Thanks, Qumangaapik. Next slide, please.
Hello. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Woohoo. Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Thank you. I'm going to be reading my notebook, and I'm going to show you my cards while I go through my notebook. So here I go. To use the decks, we first would need to find out what we need for the event, program, or project. perhaps we already have a coordinator for the event, so we have to find out the budget and secure it. And that is where funding comes in. Let me visit quickly. Oh no, I don't have it. Okay. We sometimes have to fundraise ourselves. Now that we have found out the budget, we have to figure out how to get the people interested in the event, program, or project. That is where social media comes in, and so social media comes along with graphics and marketing. Here's the social media card. Oh no, I'm blurred. Hold on.
Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, we can't. Oh, I think you muted yourself, Qumangaapik. We can't hear you.
Whoops, I'm sorry. And now that we have the fundamentals of creating a new event, we now have to take a look through at the event itself. We are going to have to set up the event with chairs and tables. If needed, we can decorate it as well. Now that the venue is set up, we need to invite people with the posters we made, and also through social media. So now that we have the program, we need to give tasks to the staff.
Next slide.
That is where the host card comes in, and the photographer card comes in. Also, the facility maintenance for the sound effects, the lightings, whatnot, and any other role that's needed for the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think you can see that the cards are very varied. Like some of them contain roles. So for instance, tournament coordinator, and some of them contain tasks, and some of them contain kind of activities or events that might happen within a larger event or sport tournament. And so we're excited to see, how they're being used and if they're being used by the rec coordinators after we did the initial training. So next slide, please. So thank you so much today, and we have some time for questions.